Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Barbara Holmes with United Methodist Wesley Foundation Ministries and your host for this weekly public affairs program brought to you by Austin Metropolitan Ministries. A repeating subject of our show has been an introduction to different faith traditions here in Austin. Today we're going to become better acquainted with the Episcopal Church. In 1840, the Austin City Gazette newspaper published a census which stated there were 856 persons in town. Almost 10% of that population, 73, claimed a religious preference, and 11 of those were Episcopalians. That prompted an Episcopalian missionary who occasionally held services in Austin to write to the Church Board of Missions requesting a missionary be sent to Austin who would, in his words, be willing to endure hardships, a good soldier of Christ in this new, neglected, and despised country. The first Episcopal parish, named Christ Church, was organized in 1848. It was reorganized in 1851, and it took the name of Church of the Epiphany. In 1853, 2 years later, the congregation laid the cornerstone of Epiphany Church at 7th and San Jacinto Streets. This photograph, taken in 1867, shows the original church minus the cedar and mulberry trees which were cut down for firewood during the Civil War. Turmoil over the question of slavery divided the church in 1856, and another congregation named Christ Church was formed. However, after prayerful consideration and some powerful negotiations, the two congregations reunited in 1859. With that reunion, the name St. David's was chosen. This double photograph, taken in 1879 for the then popular stereopticon viewing, shows that Gothic towers and parapets had been added to the front of the church. A current photo shows that there have been some additional structure changes and the historical marker at the site. Today, St. David's is at the same location and stands as the matriarch of the Episcopal churches in Austin. These photographs and information are in The History and Treasures of St. David's Church by Daisy Barrett Tanner, and we appreciate so much the use of the book for today's show. Now, with that little bit of history, let's meet the guests who are with us today and will tell us more about Episcopal practices and traditions. And I'd like to welcome you each to Austin Faith Dialogue. The viewers will need to get to know you. This is Reverend Chuck Huffman, who is pastor at St. Matthew's Episcopal Church. This is Reverend Donna Mayfield, who is a counselor at the Pastoral Education and Family Counseling Center located at the Episcopal Seminary here in Austin. And this is Reverend Juan Jimenez. He's pastor of the newest congregation in Austin, St. Francis de Assisi, located on South 1st Street. So you all are a very representative group, and we're glad to have you. Thank you for being with us. That was a little bit of the history of how the first Episcopal church got started in Austin. Those 11 Episcopalians were really very faithful, weren't they? But Chuck, can you give us a condensation of about 200 years history and tell us, how did the Episcopal Church get started in this country?
I have to do this at warp speed.
Yeah.
As you were describing those 11 Episcopalians in Austin, it seemed to me that that parallels those early members of the Church of England who came with the early colonists 200 years before to this country, and with them they brought their faith, and in due time some Episcopal or Church of England priests followed, and the Church of England was established then in this country, concentrated mostly in the Virginia colonies, while the Roman Catholics concentrated up in what we know as Maryland, and the Congregationalists were up in Boston in that area.
What would a time frame for that be?
Well, it was
17?
over a long period of time. We're at 1600s, early 1600s up through the 1700s. And the church focused mainly on ministering to its own members in this wilderness, although there were a few daring young priests that came to this country, a young man named John Wesley, who came sponsored by one of the missionary societies in England, and they tell me he had a broken a love affair with one of the Indian ladies.
Georgia was not a good place for him.
But it was fortuitous because he went back and really got with the program and started the Methodist Church. But at the time of the Revolution, most of the Episcopal clergy, or the Church of England clergy, there were no bishops that came over. And for us, bishops are very important. We're a sacramental, a symbolic church, and bishops symbolize the apostolic authority of the church for us. And but bishops lived too well. They didn't want to come to the colonies and rough it, and so. But the priests were willing to do it. At the time of the Revolution, most of the priests went back because they were loyal to the crown. Those that remained, along with some dedicated lay people, realized that they could no longer be the Church of England in this country. For one thing, they couldn't pledge allegiance to King George anymore. So they formed the Episcopal Church right after the Revolution. I think the first prayer book was published or printed in 1789. And so the Episcopal Church was established in this country. And Episcopalians have, like all Christians, have an evangelical zeal as part of our mandate from Christ himself. And the first foreign mission diocese was in a place called Texas, and while it was still a republic. As a matter of fact, the diocese began in 1838, and then when Texas became a state, it became a domestic missionary diocese.
It wasn't foreign any
It wasn't
longer.
foreign anymore. It was domestic, and then in 1849, when the diocese became a full supporting diocese, and we were on our way in this area.
Well, there were some intrepid souls that made it down this far, but that was a long way to come, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, when you mentioned the bishops, I think it's helpful for viewers to talk a little bit about how the church is organized, the way you structure yourself to carry out mission. And so let's talk about that a little bit. You mentioned the authority that symbolizes. And Donna, what would you say the role of a bishop is?
Well, the primary role of the bishop is to be the chief pastor and priest over his flock. And the bishop has a variety of things that he does that no one else does. He ordains deacons, he ordains priests, and he joins in the ordaining of other bishops. He's also called to proclaim the gospel to his people, and primarily to be a leader over his people.
So the bishop would try to get around in a diocese and see the constituents.
The bishop travels a lot.
Yeah. More about structure from denomination to denomination. It's interesting how congregations and their pastoral leadership get together. Some congregations, in some denominations, a pastor is called. The congregations visit, they go around, listen to people, preach. In others, very little is done about it except the authority, such as the bishop or a regional authority, appoints or ascends someone. I don't want to get too complicated, but how does that happen in the Episcopal Church?
We're in the first category. That is, a priest is called to serve as the rector of a congregation with the advice of the bishop, who counsels with the vestry and tells them how to go about doing it. And particularly if it's a priest from outside the diocese who has to have the bishop's approval, the bishop lets the congregation call its own person. Once he's there and once he's installed, he's there forever, until he retires or until he decides to accept a call somewhere else, or until he gets into some kind of problem.
Well, there are ways to take care of that too, I'm sure. But Juan, you have not always grown up, you did not grow up in the Episcopal tradition, and you came to it by intention. And as you looked at it, what were some of the things about the Episcopal Church that attracted you?
I guess one of the points in the Episcopal Church that attracted me was the emphasis on scripture, tradition, and reason. And that somehow in the Episcopal Church we see ourselves between the Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic Church, perhaps taking some of the best points of both traditions. And I like that very well.
Well, that's a good description. That's helpful. Donna, how would you describe any distinguishing characteristics of Episcopals?
I guess what makes us all alike is that we're all so different. The Episcopal Church has become something of a stew pot. So many Episcopalians come from other traditions. I was Lutheran myself, born and raised in the Lutheran Church, and as an adult chose the Episcopal Church. Any Episcopal church you go to is going to have a wide variety of people who were raised in other traditions and then for one reason or another found their home in the Episcopal Church. That's one distinguishing characteristic anyway.
That it is really a lot of things have come together for people. You mentioned the liturgy, and would you add anything to what Donna said about what would you say was distinctive about Episcopalians?
Well, one thing is it's the Church of England, which is our mother church, and all of the Anglican communion sees itself as being very broad and it's inclusive in its understanding that it's a bridge church. Back during the Reformation, for example, in England, you had the Presbyterians on one side and the Roman Catholics on the other. The Church of England was in the middle, trying to bridge that. And so we've got a wide diversity, great diversity, and maintaining a unity in this diversity, I think, is the genius of the Episcopal Church.
Well, another thing that is just very important is the way ordination is carried out in a denomination, and there's a wide spectrum of practices on that too. What are some highlights in the Episcopal tradition? First, are there requirements? And then secondly, you mentioned the apostolic tradition. How is the authority of the church? You mentioned the bishop ordains, but talk a little bit about that. Can anybody just walk in and become ordained?
No. The bishop has great discretionary power, but he has the absolute authority in a diocese as to who he accepts first as a postulant, and he'll set his own criteria for that. And what he will require as a way of training. Our diocese, our bishop requires that a person have a college degree, an undergraduate degree, and then 3 years of seminary. The canons do require that the process begin with the congregation. Just as the congregation calls a minister to come and be their rector, so they also call people to send them off to be prepared for the ordained ministry. So it's the call of the congregation. The individual has a call. They feel like God wants them to do this. But unless the congregation sees this person as someone they want to set aside, to set apart, to preach for them, to represent them, to pray for them, to be their person, their parson. So it begins there. So
it's rooted in a local congregation.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Will come full circle by the time probably serves a congregation.
Right. And then there are a lot of steps. We have commissions on ministry and
16.
Standing 16.
I counted them.
The steps.
Donna's on the commission of ministry now, and it's a very important commission.
Well, all this time we've talked about the bishop and clergy. We've pretty well said he. And I think if anybody's been listening to the news lately, they know that you're going to have to watch your language there, because the consecration of the first woman bishop of the church has caused a lot of publicity. And as I read and heard that, I thought, well, that really is historic. But Donna, how long have women been ordained in the Episcopal Church?
Well, we go back pretty far. The first women deacons were ordained back in 1970, and they were referred to as deaconesses. Deaconesses? That sounds funny.
Yeah.
Then later on in 1974, the infamous Philadelphia 11 women were ordained irregularly to the priesthood. And then 2 years later, the House of Bishops and the House of Deputies finally passed a change to the canons, declaring that both men and women would be considered for the ordained ministry to the priesthood. So irregularly since 74 and regularly since 76.
Oh, have lots of women chosen to go into ordained ministry? What do you think some of the numbers might be as a denomination? How many women clergy might there be?
Actually, I have no idea how many there are.
The percentage or
throughout the United States. There are more up east than there are down in the south still. Things are a little slower to move down south. It takes a while. But I know here in the Diocese of Texas, we have 10 women ordained right now. Quite a few coming along in the ranks, but there are 10 of us right now, out of approximately 300 clergy.
Well, since 76, that is fairly regular progress, seems to me. Well, all of those ways that the church structures itself and has authority here and doesn't have authority here, it's just fascinating because it all comes together. And before we leave this area of structure, there was one thing I wanted to ask you. Chuck, you are dean of the Convocation of Episcopal Churches in Austin. And what is the convocation and why is that organized?
The convocation is a geographical piece of the diocese. There are 10 convocations in the Diocese of Texas, which is not all of the state of Texas. Incidentally, there are 6 dioceses in Texas, but in our diocese, which is the Diocese of Texas, there are 10 convocations. Each has a dean who has no authority really except to convene meetings and to ours is primarily a communication means, a support method of when something happens, the bishop's got somebody to call to talk to. Something happens in a particular convocation.
So,
but I have no authority.
Do you meet regularly?
We meet once a month. The clergy, the Episcopal clergy meet once a month and have lunch together and have a program and just, share with each other ideas and
so fellowship is a big part of it.
Is about the biggest thing we do.
But that communication is very difficult.
It really is. It really is.
And you need to work at that. So
it really keeps the rest of the congregations more or less together.
But as the dean, your responsibilities more are just as a convener, and you don't order people around or anything.
That's right. There's no money, just title.
As I visited with you, Juan, before the show, I was fascinated by the route your journey that has led you here to Austin has taken, and it is such an interesting story. I'd like for you to tell us briefly a little bit about that.
Okay, I would guess my route was, as you said, it's a little bit different. I was born in Cuba, and I came to the United States in 1961 due to the political situation there. I finished high school, and then I went to a Roman Catholic monastery in Spain for 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, I came back to the United States, and I attended college in Kansas. And I went to Nebraska to do my graduate studies in philosophy. There was that I found out about the Episcopal Church. And due to lack of money, I started working on the railroad, and I became a locomotive engineer, and I was a locomotive engineer for 14 years.
In Nebraska?
In Nebraska, yes, of all places. whenever I tell anybody I live in Nebraska for 14 years, they look at me like if I were crazy, and they wonder what they can't believe it. But yes.
Well, let me go back. The 2 years that you spent in a monastery in Spain, that was as a lay person, or were you moving toward orders?
I was studying for the priesthood at the time.
And then you came back and chose not to pursue that any further.
That's right, yes.
And I interrupted you. You were working on the railroad in Nebraska.
And at that time, my first wife died, and I decided to examine my life and see what I wanted to do. And I decided that all along what I had wanted was to study for ordained ministry. And I came to seminary in Austin, and I did my studies here. While I was going to seminary, since I am bilingual, I was doing my field education at the Hispanic group that was meeting here, and eventually I was asked to take the group over. And even though I was being sponsored by the Diocese of Nebraska, the Bishop of Texas asked the Bishop of Nebraska if I could stay here, and that's where I am now.
And that's the kind of role you were talking about. The bishop has discretion over who is in the area, and well, we're so glad it worked out that way. You are now serving the congregation. How old is that congregation?
He's a little over a year old. He's about 16 months old.
Well, we're going to talk a little more about that. But while you were talking about the kind of international journey that you've had, Donna, you came into the ordained ministry, I suppose, without ever leaving Austin.
That's right, I did.
You were a member of an Episcopal parish here, and since there were not a lot of role models for women clergy, were there some things about the ministry, education, music, counseling, or a particular person that led you a little along the way and attracted you to ordination?
Sure. Actually, my life has always had a way of moving backwards into whatever it is I'm going to do. And this was no exception. I began as a volunteer chaplain at St. David's Hospital many, many years ago. And the Reverend Chuck Meyer, who's the director of pastoral care at St. David's, took me under his wing. At that time, had no assistants, and I had no credentials. And he said, if you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach. And I was willing to learn. And I fell in love with that ministry and ended up doing it full-time for 2 years. It was during that time that I met the Reverend Will Sprong at the seminary, and we became friends, and he counseled me through some difficult times in my life. And as a result of all that, with Will's pushing and Chuck's tugging, I found myself applying to seminary.
So you really kind of had some Nebraskan working on the railroad, even though you never left here.
I did, yeah.
Well, what ministries have you served since becoming ordained?
Well, I've continued to do some limited hospital work. I served for 2.5 years full-time on the staff of St. David's Church here in Austin. And that was just general parish ministry. I did a little bit of everything. Since then, I've specialized in pastoral counseling, which is what I'm doing now at the Pastoral Education and Family Counseling Center. I continue to preach, I continue to celebrate, I teach a little bit on the side, I do whatever I'm asked to do, because I have a tendency to enjoy just about every aspect of the ordained ministry. So I like to keep busy doing all of it.
Are there other women clergy here in Austin?
There's 3 of us right now.
Well, you're not alone then, are you? You all were both mentioned the seminary being here in Austin, and that is really worth mentioning. Chuck, you ought to tell us a little bit about the Episcopal Seminary of the Southwest. What's its student enrollment now?
I'm told it's about 65 students and about 12 faculty and 25 Lutheran students. They use our facility, but they have their own faculty and dean and so forth. And seminary began in the 50s as a dream of Bishop Quinn and then Bishop Hines, and it's unique in that they have chosen to, recognizing that we live in a in a two-culture world here in Texas with the Hispanic influence, that this seminary sees itself as trying to deal with the issues that people will have living in two cultures. Of course, that applies anywhere, you know, I mean, the two cultures can be any two, but they're focusing on that as a primary thrust of this particular seminary, in addition to doing the other things.
Well, that is a very good tie-in, too. I want to hear a little more about the congregation that you're working with and the center there. We're almost out of time, but the Good Samaritan Center there is going to serve the community and have a medical aspect to it.
We're almost ready to open the clinic. We're waiting on permits right now. We are trying to empower the neighbors of that area, which is basically South Central Austin. We're located in South First Street, and we have a number of programs through which we try to empower, preach the gospel and empower those people to be what God meant them to be.
Well, I'm sorry that we don't have time to visit and go on about how much we have learned. You've been such wonderful guests. It's so good to have you. Thank you very much. We need to conclude, and we'll come full circle by remembering that first Episcopal missionary that was far-sighted and very realistic in 1840 when he wrote of hardships in a new country. But those early efforts were sound and took root, and the Episcopal Church in the Austin area has flourished. Thank you for being with us today, and you're invited to join us again next week at the same time. Good day.